All right, time to jump into some week 3 matchups. He's a weekly guest on the Joe Holka Show. You guys know him by now, but if you're not reading his weekly article, the worksheet at sharpfootballanalysis.com, you're definitely doing it wrong. So Rich Hribar, welcome back, my friend. How are things?
Week 3, Joe. I mean, we're cooking here. We got, some injuries on the slate here that we lost some big pieces last week, but we're starting to figure this thing out. The sample's building. Still not quite enough to really latch onto fully, but these things are starting to mount up for us to kind of figure out what these teams are this season.
Yeah, I was just actually talking about that, how I feel like, what is it, like week 4, the data kind of makes it a little bit more reliable, but I think week 3 is an interesting week too, because week 1, I think week 1, everyone has all their biases from the entire summer, all of that. You're right, you're wrong, whatever it is. Week 2, people are still probably holding on, thinking it was a fluke, doesn't matter. But then something really goes wrong after week 2, and you have to kind of backtrack a little bit and maybe this is reality, right? So before we jump into, is there anything like that that you were just on all summer and you feel like maybe you might be wrong with 2 week sample size here?
I mean, there's a lot. I mean, when we talk about
right.
I talk about every player for 7 months, things that are going to happen, but definitely feel really good. I mean, I was high, and one of the people it came around all summer that Miles Sanders came around and then he got hurt at the end of the year. But I mean, I was really out in front early on him, and it looks like we're going to be justified based on his usage in week 2. We'll probably talk about him too, because we've got some of these moving pieces and injuries. But yeah, still, I mean, think with some things that people are grasping onto. I mean, it looks like Deontay Johnson is the Steelers wide receiver 1, but still looks like Juju. If you go to rankings, he's ranked as a top 10 wide receiver still by the industry. But I've already got Deontay Johnson ahead of Juju now. I think that just the amount of targets that he gets and how the types of easy targets he gets as well is enough for me to vault him over there. And it looks like, maybe with Claypool even too, that Juju, man, they might not even bring him back. He might not even be on their radar to resign. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out the rest of the season as well.
Yeah, I love it, man. A lot of really sharp people who are on Deontay, so it's nice to see something like that. People get rewarded, right? It was like the same thing with Calvin Ridley. It gets to the point where it's like, this is just so chalk that I want to be different in some ways, but then it's just like, okay, I guess he really is Godwin in 2020. We'll see. I guess good start. It's 2 weeks. I'll chill for a second.
Yeah. Sometimes the herd does know what they're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, every now and then. In terms of the herd of top-end running backs, Reeves, very much thinned out a little bit this past week. So obviously the 2 guys behind me, half my studio is literally irrelevant now with McCaffrey and Barkley just out. But Reeves, I got to ask you, man, who are our top running back 1 options now? I guess I guess if you take Zeke completely out of it, is there any of these guys like Miles Sanders, Kenyon Drake, James Conner? Which one of these guys do you think is the one that separates himself, or at least have the chance to be one of the guys we're talking about in the same breath as some of these other guys we used to?
Yeah, definitely in week 3, we've got a few guys that are still bell cow guys that are involved in the pass game that have favorable matchups that we can kind of latch onto. And a couple of these guys kind of popped last week that you kind of hit on some of their names. Well, one definitely we kind of alluded to is Miles Sanders. He returning to the lineup last week. He played 78% of the team snaps, 23 of 30 backfield touches. He had 131 yards. He had a touchdown. He lost a fumble, and there was no running back committee, no, bring in Boston Scott. He also ran 31 pass routes to just 8 for Boston Scott. So that's what we love. We want these guys in DFS that can't get game scripted out. That's what we always talk about. Remember Derrick Henry became the chalk a little bit last week, but he's also not a guy that, you don't get any receiving juice. You don't hit for ceilings in fantasy. So now we've got Sanders as a large home favorite. They're 6-point favorites. They had a Cincinnati defense that just allowed 151 yards to the Chargers backfield in week 1. They allowed 234 yards to the Browns backfield in week 2. And they've allowed 5 touchdowns to running backs to start the season. So we love that spot. We've got Kenyon Drake, who people were high on to come off season, but we started to build up this data. Like we said, it's starting to look like through 2 weeks that Kenyon Drake just ran into 2 legitimate run stuffing buzzsaws to start the season against San Francisco and Washington. But the touches are still there. So he's getting a great matchup against Detroit. They've been the opposite of Washington and San Francisco to start the year. They've allowed a league high almost 7 yards per carry to opposing backfields. They're 20th in receiving points allowed to backfields, and it hasn't just been the Packers. They were giving up 5 yards per carry to David Montgomery in week 1. The Bears just got scripted out of that game. Detroit's allowed 49% of the rushing attempts to go for 5 or more yards against them. That's the highest rate in the league. 19% of the runs against them have gone for 10 or more yards. That's by far the highest rate in the league. League averages are just 34% and 11% in those kind of categories, start the year through 2 weeks. And then James Conner, is another guy too that, I think a lot of people were looking at some type of backfield split last week to come with Benny Snell. He was a hot waiver wire pickup. Conner played 50 snaps to just 10 for Benny Snell. Benny Snell lost a fumble. It was a second fumble as many weeks. Can't get on the field when these coaches let you fumble, even though we know they're highly, variant occurrences. And then Conner turned those touches into 121 total yards. And now is getting a Houston defense that's allowed 6.3 yards per carry to opposing backfields. They have allowed 51% of the yards against the Texans so far have come via rushing. That's the highest rate in the NFL through 2 weeks of the season, and they're a league worst minus 227 rushing yards than their opponent. And Conner also gets David DeCastro back this week, at right guard. So those are 3 guys I think that are on the board in this slate. When we want to pair with Zeke, we want to still pay for these running backs that I believe are bell cow backs that haven't really that just run into tremendous matchups that we can kind of pay for, and they're going to get receiving work.
Reebs, week 3, man, you are on it. You just took about almost every note I had for all of those players you were talking about. So I was bringing up, this is the data table that we have at Line Movement. It's a free resource. But one of the things that stood out to me right away, Miles Sanders at 6,400, a guy that we can probably project for 23 touches or so again this week. I love what you said about how, yes, he fumbled, but he still saw 23 touches in this game. Like down the stretch last year, we saw his volume kind of stabilize a little bit if you include the playoffs. So love to see that again. Love this game overall. This Philly and Cincinnati game, 8th fastest pace for Philly, 4th fastest pace so far this year. So I love that. The Drake one I think is really interesting because Drake overall, people want to just bury this guy after a slow start, but he actually out-touched Edmonds 22-6 last week. That's not a crazy number by any means, but the matchup is just so good. We saw what the Bears and the Packers did to them on the ground through the first 2 weeks. So I'm all about the Drake this week for sure. If we go down a little bit, Reebs, what are we doing with all these backup running backs? The Mike Davis, I guess the mess that's following Saquon for the Giants, and then your boy, or I guess I'll say it, my boy. I like Jerick McKinnon quite a bit as a prospect. So out of all those guys, are we buying into any of these cheap guys this week? I think that's going to be probably the key to this entire slate.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how people handle it and which one of these guys ends up being, kind of chalky or not chalky, or if either do. Because, at any time we get one of these running back kind of people want to call them free squares and they go to them, it doesn't always work out the way we planned. Sure, Jonathan Taylor hit last week, and I think you can make a really strong objective case for Jonathan Taylor last week that was kind of harder to fade, like we talked about leading into the show with the Calvin Ridleys and stuff like that. Sometimes the herd does know what they're talking about, but these guys have a little bit of ambiguity to them. I mean, Mike Davis, filling in for Christian McCaffrey, we can't really expect him to get, 95% of the snaps and 90% of the touches like Christian McCaffrey was getting. But anytime Mike Davis has played, he only has 13 career games where he's had double-digit touches, but in those games he's averaged 12.2 PPR points per game. We did see him get the 8 catches. I don't know if we're going to see that happen again, but this Chargers matchup, we've got them as a road dog. So you're going to be counting on what thing first? Receiving work first is what you're counting when you have a huge road dog and a running back. So he's going to need to kind of hold on to that and then not to use Reggie Bonnafon in any capacity or get Curtis Samuel mixed in, because Curtis Samuel's 8 out is only 5.7 yards this year, which is far cry from where it was last year. They're using him near the line of scrimmage. And the Chargers have just been awesome against the run against 2 good backs. They held Joe Mixon to 69 yards and 19 carries in week 1. Clyde Edwards-Helaire only had 38 yards on 10 carries when they were, scripted into the run last week. So Mike Davis is going to need those receptions this week. We don't like to really chase road dog running backs like that. So it's going to be interesting to see if people flock to him and see if he's going to get that usage. And you talked about Jerick McKinnon. He's coming off of, missing the past 2 years. I think the 49ers are going to probably not thrust him into, a 15 plus touch role immediately just because they're kind of have to. We were in a very similar spot with the 49ers last year in week 2. If you remember, Tevin Coleman got hurt in week 1 last year against the Bucs, and everyone said week 2, Matt Breida's to play. We got to get on Matt Breida. And they came into that game against the Bengals and gave 16 touches to Raheem Mostert, 13 touches to Matt Breida, and 10 touches to Jeffrey Wilson. Also, Jeffrey Wilson has converted 4 or 5 carries with the 49ers the past year inside the 5-yard line for touchdowns. He's had a role near the goal line, and he's had a trustworthy role near the goal line that he's converted. So even if the 49ers are knocking on the door for a touchdown, it might not be McKinnon who gets it, even though he has 2 touchdowns through the first 2 weeks of the season. And McKinnon, they might not change his role at all. He's played 32 snaps and has run 19 pass routes on those snaps. He's just had 3 carries in each game. So we're going to have to probably count on both of these guys to really do a lot of their lifting through the receiving game first, which gives them kind of a floor and makes them kind of appealing. But these guys aren't 4K running backs. Like, DK wasn't on it this week. They didn't sneak in under the radar. Talking about paying 5-1 for a guy like Mike Davis and 4-9 for Jerick McKinnon, and you might not get a lot of rushing work from either of these guys. And in the case of McKinnon, you might not even get a touchdown.
Reebs, I actually really like this week because I think there's a lot of people that are just going to, I love how you kind of rip on the hashtag free square. Also, I do that similarly because I think some people throw that around a little bit too aggressively, but I'm just clearly all we care about is volume at running back. Can we actively project a guy like Mike Davis, a guy like Jerick McKinnon for over 15 touches? So from my perspective, if we can't, you're losing a lot of floor and you're losing a lot of ceiling at the easiest position to project, right? So I honestly think I might just live in this range of Miles Sanders, of even if you wanted to put James Conner and in that range, Kenyon Drake, that mid-range, and then maybe you end up paying up for Zeke, something like that. Yeah. I don't know. I think if everyone's just going to pay down a running back, I'm just going to jam in all the running back value I can, and it's going to already lead me to a different type of roster. So that's kind of where my head's at. I'll say this. So there's one where we try and do at least one game a week that people might be, I guess, a little bit underweight on. Maybe some people are overlooking it in the betting markets. This one was just one we probably couldn't ignore in terms of being a high-scoring game. Dallas and Seattle, this one we're going to see some fireworks, right? What do you think about this game?
Yeah, I always try to pick a fun game, and I always try to pick a game where you're gonna give me backlash on the first 2 weeks. But this just because I like to do that.
Was that your little dig on saying that you were right? You're right, Reeves. If you want me to say it, I'll say it.
No, you were right last week. We're 1-1.
There were some good options there still.
Week 1 we were good. Yeah, we could have did Philadelphia if you wanted to do Philadelphia too. But this game you just look at the amount of fireworks that are in this game on the main slate. It's going to be really hard to run away from some of these pieces. And I don't know how you typically attack when you have a game stacks, they're going to be real chalky. And how you want to approach it, but this has a lot of variance because there's so many moving parts. It's not a necessarily concentrated target trees. There's on the Seattle side a little bit, but from everyone's kind of expensive here too, so it makes it kind of you have to kind of go back and forth. So where are the cheap pieces in this game? They're not the quarterback position, even though both are probably the top 2 guys on the main slate. You look at Russell Wilson; he's thrown already a league high 4 touchdown passes, 20 yards plus. Dallas is tied for the league lead in 20+ yard completions allowed with Atlanta and Miami so far through 2 weeks. Then you look at just where do these guys get the ball to? They get the ball to what we like. They're wide receivers. Russell Wilson is averaging 12.1 yards per pass attempt to wide receivers. That's first in the NFL. Dak Prescott is 9th at 9.6 yards targeting his wide receivers. Seattle so far has been, and it's been a little bit game script induced, but they've been a little bit of kind of a pass funnel, and some of that has to do with who they've played to, Atlanta and New England. But 73% of the non-quarterback fantasy points allowed by Seattle have been to opposing wide receivers so far through 2 weeks. They've just been getting crushed by wide receivers. And then you look at what does Dallas have? 3 really good wide receivers. And, obviously everyone's going to flock to CeeDee Lamb in this game. He had his first 100-yard game last week. Seattle so far through the slot in the first 2 games that they've played have allowed 12 catches for 179 yards in week 1, and then 15 catches for 232 yards in the slot. So, they're just getting bludgeoned into the middle of the field. We can look at that. We can look at Amari Cooper in this game. He kind of has just been just toeing the line, 10 for 81, 6 for 100, really solid. CeeDee Lamb's getting all the buzz, but Seattle's already allowed 6 different wide receivers to have double-digit PPR points. They've only played 2 games. They've allowed 4 wide receiver 1 scoring weeks through just 2 weeks in 2 games. People are down on Michael Gallup. Michael Gallup's still been out there. He's run a route on 92% of the Dallas dropbacks. I understand the results haven't been there. He's only been targeted at 9.1% of his routes. It was 22% 10% a year ago. So we're seeing some of that squeeze. CeeDee Lamb has kind of put on the target tree there. But I mean, we talked about just the amount of points that Seattle's allowed to wide receivers. He's worth another look to go back to the well here, especially because people are going to be so high on CeeDee Lamb, and he's going to have the highest ownership in this game by far. And then, on the other side, you've got DK Metcalf kind of picking up right where he left off. Dating back to last season, DK Metcalf has now reached the end zone in 5 of his past 7 games. He's averaged 98 receiving yards over his past 5 games on the field. And Chidobe Awuzie is going to miss this game with a hamstring injury. It's really hard not to fall in love with both these passing games. Zeke's going to be high owned on their side. I think your leverage plays are probably Gallup and Chris Carson. If you want to kind of, get cute as, leverage plays in this game. I think Lamb will be the highest owned guy, but it's really hard to get away from this game. I think that it's justified. The 56-point total is really justified.
I'll say this, like CeeDee Lamb, $100 cheaper than Michael Gallup. That makes me want to play Michael Gallup. But let me at least play devil's advocate here before you get out of here, Reebs. So, and I have no data to back this up. All I have, honestly, is my history with Russell Wilson and Pete Carroll. So is there a concern that Pete Carroll is the most unhappy 2-0 coach in the NFL because of what's happening with his offense? They're no longer controlling the ball. They're putting up all these points. Like, is there a chance that like everyone's all in on this game? And by the way, you made a good point. These guys are so expensive that if you are all in on this game, you're probably playing these cheaper running backs. So this might be like my ultimate leverage slate if I don't pay down for these running backs and for some reason I don't play much of this game. And if 2 things break right, like these running backs aren't what we thought, and then for some reason this game ends up being terrible because Pete Carroll just wants to run the ball again, like I might win all the money this week. I think that's what I've talked myself into it. But what do you think the chances are that actually happens? Not me win all the money, but actually them run the ball a lot.
I think they're probably low just because the Dallas defense is just so bad, man. I actually think it's not the passing that bothers Pete Carroll. I mean, what has to bother Pete Carroll so far is the way his pass defense is played. Being that old DB coach, he's a defensive back coach by nature. I think it has to be driving him crazy that he's just getting shredded through the air. I mean, Cam Newton's dropping 400 yards on you with Demir Byrd and N'Keal Harry and Julian Edelman. A 35-year-old Julian Edelman just had his highest career receiving yards in a game against your secondary. I think that has to be driving crazy because that's what they built this team on. Seattle's one of these teams in the offseason. There's a big debate on what wins more, pass rush or pass coverage. And Seattle invested totally into pass coverage and, trading for Quentin Dunbar, adding Jamal Adams. And so far the pass coverage has not been there. So, I mean, that has to be driving him the most crazy than it is just Russ cooking.
Rich Hribar, everyone. If you're not already, you probably are. Be sure and follow him on Twitter. He's at LordReebs. We'll see you next week, man. Have a great week 3.
Good luck, everyone.